Good evening, everybody. How we doing, family? I will wait for about 60 seconds or so till some folks start hopping on. Then I'll bring my brother Jemar on, and then we'll get it popping. Wave if you can hear me. Wave if you can see me. How y'all doing? Good evening. Good evening. What's up? What's up? Dante, what's up, fam? What's going on? What's going on? We're about to bring Jemar on, and we are going to reflect on George Floyd's murder, which was made public 1 year ago. My brother. How y'all doing? What's up? I'm waving at as many people as I can as you hop on. Hi, Carrie. Awesome. All right, let me see if Jemar is in here. My brother. How you doing, family? Somber day, but a day worthy of reflection. A day worthy of taking stock in how we feel in our bodies, what we feel in our hearts, and what lingers in our minds and our souls. All right, let's bring in Jemar now. Cool. Keep waving. I appreciate the waves. Hi, Jessica. Hi, Christ Grad. Navy Mustang. Okay, there he is. I don't know why. It's just let me send requests, Jay. It's not actually let me bring you on. I have no idea what's happening. Claude, what's up, brother? Much love, much love. Jamar, resend your request, and then we'll see if that works. Where y'all from? Where y'all watching? Where you watching? Type in the comments where you're watching. Would love to shout out your city, your area code, wherever you're at. Obviously, I'm in sunny Pensacola, Florida. Someone has to live here, right? On Paradise. ATL in the house. Cleveland. Every time I see Cleveland now, I think of the LeBron moment after he won. Cleveland, this is for you. Jackson, Baltimore, San Antonio. What's up, fam? All right. I think it should work now. We're going to bring Jay in.
Sure look good tonight. Oh.
This live turned into something else, man. What's going on over there, man? What's going on over there? What's going on over there, man? Come on,
Always
bro.
got a song in my soul, brother.
You share it with us even when we don't ask.
Fortunate you. Lucky
No,
you.
I listen, I appreciate the song, man. I appreciate it. Coming from your soul. That was a song that definitely you've been through some things. That's what we can tell through that song. My
I,
brother, man. I haven't talked to you all weekend, man. How you doing, bro?
it's been a minute, man. I just got back from a week in Boston, checking out the new city.
Awesome, man. That's
Yeah,
incredible. Yeah, I was just in Chicago actually doing some cross-cultural collective liberation work. So excited about, some things to come. So
that's what's up.
yeah, man. So it's a year, man. We wanted to hang out and talk about a year after George Floyd. And I think this day feels awkward and different for a number of reasons. Number one, I think whenever you talk about a year or a commemoration of any sort, you want those commemorations to be for positive things, good things. This is obviously not that. And it's also strange because of the conviction of Derek Chauvin, guilty on all three counts of murder that was recently handed down. And so it's one of those things where this day feels odd and awkward, not just because of those things, but also because of how we feel in our bodies. So what are you reflecting on today, Jemar? Because I know you have been very passionate about marking this moment and what it means for us.
So, as a historian, anniversaries always matter to me. The shout out to the witness today in history, and follow that. What's the handle, Tyler?
Uh, Witness OTD, the Witness
Witness
OTD
on
are on
today.
this day.
Very good. So anniversaries are always meaningful to me because they offer us an opportunity to reflect. So you asked sort of like what I'm pondering today, and it's the sort of where are we now question. 1 year later, what has changed? What hasn't changed? What progress have we made? What do we still have yet to make? So those are the questions rattling around in my brain now. There's a ton of articles on this very topic. But I view it both as a Black person and as a Christian. And that, I think, those two identities and elements in conversation, I think lend an interesting perspective, which I'm sure you have some thoughts on as well.
I love that you said it's in conversation. I like to say sometimes it's an argument, right? I
Yeah,
mean, it is true that it's a conversation in the sense that, you know, they both bring to bear part of who we are and a central part of who we are that we're never going to not be. But at the same time, sometimes it feels as though they're contradictory.
that's
You
right.
know, it feels as though, especially on a day like today, the hope that is found in my Christian faith is at odds with the despair that is found in my blackness,
Exactly.
right? You
Exactly.
know,
I wonder if folks have heard the term Afro pessimism.
yes.
It's this idea that through our racial framing in this nation, that not much is ever going to change.
Mm,
That true radical transformation is at best a long shot.
mm. You know what's so interesting about that, Jemar, is I was reading a article by, I believe it was Adam Serwer in the New York Times, and I'm thinking about obviously a year later, and we're talking about that, but he was talking about Tulsa 100 years later and connecting what was at the time a movement, what he was kind of framing as 2016, a movement for justice for Terrence Crutcher, who was killed in Tulsa, and how that connects to also Black Wall Street 100 years ago. And I'm thinking about how much time doesn't always change things, but also how little time is necessary for things to change.
Mm, mm,
So time doesn't always change things, right? Time heals all wounds. People say that. That's not true. Time does not always change things, but it doesn't take a lot of time for things to change,
man,
right?
that's
And when you process the fact that it doesn't take a lot of time for things to change, it reshapes how we mark moments and commemorate moments, because what we realize is it was not that long ago for any of these things that we talk about in history. Yet in the same breath, we can say that a year from now or 6 months from now, real change can substantively take place for us
right.
if we commit to the will to change, right? The
Mm,
will to change. And this helps me because, I always think in context of God, the fact that God creates time. And when God created time, God was outside of time. Time didn't exist, right? And God steps into time, creates time, then steps into time, right? And it's comforting today to know that we serve a God who is not bound to the passing of time, but can act and move in a moment. And what I desire more than anything else today, on days like today, is is the moment when God will act. Because God is always working, but the moment when the actions of God are made known and the time that we have waited doesn't feel as long in the context of God stepping into it. That's what I'm thinking about today.
getting real philosophical and theological on
Hey man,
typically do.
I'm
As
preparing for
you
Sunday. All right, I'm preparing for Sunday. Golly, man.
so that's a fantastic point, and it's also important to remember that time builds on time.
Hmm.
Movements build on movements, right? So I was reading about this incredible historical event. If you want the details, go to my Twitter account. But it was about the siege of First Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. It's an incredible event. 1,500 Black people packed into First Baptist Church in Montgomery in support of the Freedom Riders, who the day before had been beaten to a bloody pulp and were basically hiding out in the church. Meanwhile, 3,000 white people gathered around the church. And if the wind had blown another way, if a spark had hit the right way, they were throwing Molotov cocktails, they could have burned all those people alive. It would have been one of the most horrific racial disasters in our nation's history. And it was only slimly averted, right? But I say that because the church, First Baptist Montgomery, is a historic church organized in 1867, shortly after the Civil War. They built a wood frame building that burned down around 1910. And to repair it, they asked church members to bring a brick a day. And so its nickname is Brick a Day Church. And it took them 5 years, but they built a brick edifice, a brick church that is still standing over a century later. And I think of First Baptist Church Montgomery, nicknamed Brick a Day Church, as I think about the Black freedom struggle.
My.
That every movement, every moment, every action, every march, every law changed, every policy changed is a brick a day. And we're building this edifice of a liberated people, which is not by happenstance comprised oftentimes of Black Christians.
A brick a day.
Brick a day.
That feels heavy, man. You know, it seems so small, but it feels so heavy.
It feels so heavy. I told you before when we were corresponding about today's Behind the Mic, I had a lot to say. Just let me know.
Go ahead, go for it. I'm letting you go.
Okay.
This is what I like to hear. I got my little sermonette out the way. I did my Easter speech. Now it's on you.
Well, we can riff off of this, but it's very personal to me because I was writing my second book, How to Fight Racism, in the midst of the 2020 uprisings. And I actually went back and rewrote the introduction in light of some of those events. And I took a risk. You know, as writers, we sometimes take risks and put stuff out there that we're not quite sure how it's going to land. We're not even quite sure if we're right. But this is what I wrote. The very first line of the book says this: something is different this time. Something is different this time. And for careful interviewers, they tend to ask me, do I believe that? Because what they're getting at is, has enough changed? Has anything changed for you to say that it's different this time? And let me just, it sounds self-serving, but I just want to read it because I already said it, so I don't want to reinvent it.
Well, you better read that book. It's sitting right above your head. You better read that book.
Something is different this time. I could hardly believe I had just typed those words in a tweet for thousands of people to read. I study history. I have the receipts of this nation's racial failures. I'm a Black man in the United States. I know firsthand that racism still pervades our society. I am neither naive nor optimistic about issues of race in this country. But in the summer of 2020, a sustained movement of protests and uprisings began to roll through the United States and around the world. A viral cell phone video showed a white police officer kneeling for 8 minutes and 46 seconds on the neck of a prostrate Black man named George Floyd. We actually need to revise that number up. Further video evidence showed that it was actually 9 minutes and 29 seconds.
Yeah, that's right.
The officer killed Floyd, and once again, a Black human being had become a hashtag. This person, made in God's image and likeness, became another victim of racism, anti-Black police brutality, and white supremacy. Floyd's murder was just the latest in a string of similar events leading up to the 2020 protests. Breonna Taylor had been killed in a barrage of bullets in a no-knock raid by police. Video footage showing Ahmaud Arbery, a black man out for a jog in a predominantly white neighborhood in Georgia, exposed 3 white men who pursued, shot, and killed him in what many called a modern-day lynching. Skipping ahead a little bit. This time did feel different. The rapid shifts we saw could hardly have been predicted just a few months prior. This is to your point, Tyler, that sometimes it doesn't take a lot of time for change to occur. But the COVID-19 pandemic and years of grassroots pressure for change had built up pressure that erupted in a flood of unexpected changes. I, as well as the countless others who dedicated their lives to the cause of racial justice, felt encouraged, exhausted, excited, and skeptical all at once. Now, time will tell if the protests and uprisings of 2020 lead to lasting transformations in the United States. What is clear is that racial justice does not occur apart from the sustained efforts of people who dedicate themselves to fighting racism in all its forms. History demonstrates, and hope requires, the fundamental belief that when people of goodwill get together, they can find creative solutions to society's most pressing problems. So, 1 year after this murder, where are we now? Did these historic uprisings have any real impact, or did they result in only symbolic changes? You've heard me say this before, Tyler. I don't believe in quote unquote merely symbolic changes, because symbols shape narratives. Symbols shape narratives. And so we can point to some of the more symbolic changes, right? Like they removed Aunt Jemima from the label. NASCAR banned the Confederate flag. Recently, the place where I'm working now at Boston University, they made Juneteenth an official day off of work for employees. And of course, I always refer to the state flag of Mississippi finally coming down after 120 years. Now, in a way, these are sort of cosmetic changes, right? But at the same time, they're helping to rewrite the narratives we tell ourselves about race in this country. So I think they're important. But most of the time when people are asking, has anything changed? They're talking about systems and policies, right? So for instance, if we look at the Minneapolis Police Department, this is sort of the epicenter of the whole thing, right? This is where George Floyd was killed. And in the wake of it, you have all these people, including elected officials, saying, we're going to abolish the police. We're going to defund the police. We're going to do all this stuff. Since then, they've walked back on a lot of that stuff.
Yes, they have.
Yes, there have been some changes. I was looking this up. Minnesota Public Radio reports that they've got an updated use of force policy that prohibits officers from shooting at moving vehicles unless safety is an issue, which of course is a gray area. This update compels officers to provide explanations every time they unholster weapons. And they've got to report every time they use handcuffs and other defensive tactics, right? We've also got the reality that in Minneapolis, the police department, 150 officers have left. They have either gone on leave, retired early, or just simply resigned. And so we've got that reality. Also in the works on a national level, many people have probably heard of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. This is a very important proposal. It's a bill that would be federal, and so it would apply across the country. And it does things like ending qualified immunity. Qualified immunity protects police officers from civil suits. That's a sticking point. That's one of the reasons why it hasn't passed yet. It lowers the threshold to prosecute officers from willful disregard for human life to reckless disregard for human life. So they don't have to prove intent. It creates a national police misconduct registry. It limits the use of chokeholds. It has new standards for no-knock warrants. It limits the sharing of military equipment by the Department of Defense to local police departments, those kinds of things. Now, Biden set a goal that it would be signed by today, May 25th, as we record this, which is the 1-year anniversary, of course, of George Floyd's murder. That's not there, but it is a bipartisan effort. So it's passed the House. And you've got Senators Cory Booker, who's a Democrat from New Jersey, and Senator Tim Scott, the only Black Republican senator, South Carolina, along with Karen Bass, who's a congresswoman from a Democratic congresswoman from California. They're all working together to get it passed, and they don't think it's months away. They think it's weeks away that they'll get something on the president's desk to pass into law. But that hasn't happened yet. Hundreds of people continue to be killed by police officers. There is a sort of retrenchment and a digging in the heels by some of quote unquote law and order and back the blue and all of that stuff. And so it all begs the question, you know, has anything changed? Has anything of substance changed?
Yeah. You know, I think why it's so important for us to ask this question and to consider this is, you know, this conversation that we have so often between symbolic and substantive change. If symbols are removed or if symbols are erected, does that lead to actual substantive change? And I think this conversation between the symbolic and the substantive is so important because our bodies are real. Our bodies are not symbols, right? Our bodies, it's so interesting how quickly people make the victims of police brutality into martyrs, and they use their bodies, deploy their bodies for utility.
Right.
So now George Floyd is a martyr. George Floyd changed things. George Floyd was a real man who just wanted to live. And when we think about the body, and when we think about how so much of our theology is underdeveloped around the body, we must remember that, you know, symbols are important because they do shape narratives, and I completely agree. And substance is important because our bodies are real. And if, you know, Paul writes it like this, if Christ didn't rise bodily, we got a problem. The symbol isn't a good enough story. If Christ didn't truly rise, pity us. We got an issue. But he did.
That's good.
So now that changes. So see, the body is real. And when you think about this, we have to be so careful of those who trade substantive change in exchange for using our bodies as performative symbols. No, our bodies are substance. Our bodies are real. And if you don't think they are, or if you treat them merely as symbolism, then we pity you.
Yeah.
Right? You should pity us, because what we have done is we have devalued the true value and meaning of our creation and what God has created in us. And so I think it's such a good question, because we're asking the question of how do we tell this story rightly in a world that is obsessed with symbolism, but cannot see our realness, that cannot see right in front of us that our bodies that matter.
And pity those who subscribe to a theology or a faith that separates soul and body, right? Like, this is what we're grappling with so often with so many white Christians, although it's selective, and we'll get into all that. But when it comes to race, just preach the gospel. What are they saying? What's the theology behind just preach the gospel? Save souls, and the rest will take care of itself. The body will take care of itself. The material world will take care of itself. Actually, we don't actually need to do much about it. We've done our due diligence as Christians by sharing the good news and making sure that you have your eternal life insurance card.
Mm.
but it's not connected to the resurrection, as you put it, right?
My,
Salvation
my.
that Jesus offers is not just a redemption of the soul, but a redemption of the body.
Mm.
It's a new heaven and a new earth, and we'll have glorified bodies. We won't be these disembodied
Yes.
spirits floating on clouds playing harps, right?
Right.
It's a bodily resurrection of Christ and us. So woe to those who believe in a just preach the gospel approach to racial justice as if one could separate
Mm-hmm.
the salvation
Mm-hmm.
of the soul from the care of the body.
And woe to those, Jemar, to add on to that point, woe to those who shrink back from talking about the substance because of fear.
Wow. Come on, man.
Woe to those
Man.
who believe that symbols will be adequate enough. And if we push for too much too soon, that then we'll miss something, we'll fumble the ball because we're not playing the right symbolic game. Woe to those who sacrifice bodies on the altar of symbolism.
Woo.
Woe to those who think that this is a game. Watch the video. I don't advocate for people to watch the video. I don't think we need black trauma. But if you get to the place where you want to sacrifice substance for symbols, thinking that that will be sufficient for where we need to go, sufficient for liberation, just for people to give us a building with a name, or take down a monument, or remove a caricature from a logo that we didn't even ask for. Woe to the people who think that is sufficient now versus the very substance. Ask George Floyd's daughter if symbols are enough. Ask Ahmaud Arbery's mother if symbols are enough. Ask Breonna Taylor's family if symbols are enough. Woe to us if we start talking so much about the theoretical, we miss the literal. People are being killed. Don't play games with this. And so we talk so much about justice that sometimes it gets to be repetitious. It gets to be where this place of, yes, justice, justice. We mention names as if they're not real people. But ask the families if they were real. They'll tell you stories. They'll tell you what their voices sounded like, how their laugh filled the room, how their presence warmed their hearts and souls. Woe to those who sacrifice the substance. That's a reminder the next time you feel self-conscious because someone tells you you're doing too much. Remember that their words aren't as real as the substance of George Floyd's body. Remember that. You got me going now. You got me going now.
Let me get your take on this, Pastor. As we're talking about substance and symbols, satisfying, all that stuff. Matthew 5. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness.
Justice.
For they shall be satisfied. Now in the Greek. Yes.
Where my Volter store at? Where my Volter store? Nah,
for they shall be satisfied.
Mm.
But we're dealing with so much dissatisfaction in this life.
Mm.
In so many ways, we're in the same struggle as our ancestors in 1619.
Mm.
So how do you unpack that for those like me and so many others who are hungering and thirsting for righteousness? Jesus says we'll be satisfied, but we're still sitting here asking the question, have we made any progress?
Man, it's what we wrestle with all the time, right? Which is the satisfaction. What is the satisfaction? And when will the satisfaction come? I think it's important to say that satisfaction doesn't come when you sit. That to sit and say, We are hungering and thirsting for righteousness and justice, but to put no corresponding action to it.
Hmm.
It's to fail to understand the essence of the call. If you are hungry and thirsty, you do not wait for food to come to you, you pursue it eagerly. And so, what many of us are missing is the earnest pursuit, right? And I know what people are thinking. Of course, I'm pursuing justice. Of course, I'm pursuing righteousness. But again, I think 2020, a year later, has taught us to recalibrate our expectations of course, I'm doing this.
Mm.
We have to recalibrate those expectations. We have to recalibrate what we are pursuing. And yes, I'm speaking to Black Christians. I'm not speaking to any other group. I'm speaking of what we do. I've been convicted about
Mm.
how I spend my money. I've been convicted about what I support. I've been convicted about who I spend most of my time with and
Wow.
for.
Wow.
I've been convicted about the things I'm not aware of in my own city. And sure, I'm aware of some things that I could pull out a laundry list of things that I'm aware of. Did you know this and did you know that? But how does that translate, again, not to the symbol of what I know, but to the substance of what I do? So now I can point to the facts that I know in my head, but how do those facts that I know reach the people who are being disenfranchised and marginalized in my own neighborhood? That's different.
Yeah.
And so again, blessed are those, for those who didn't know what I was mentioning earlier, but I think the Greek is dikaiosune. So, you're just going to have to check me on that, fact check me on that, Mr. MDiv. But yeah, so the word justice and righteousness, it's the same word. It's just a choice in the translation. The choice is, do you say righteousness or do you say justice?
Hmm.
And Nicholas Wolterstorff, in his book on justice, talks about how it doesn't make sense in the translation to just say, oh, it's righteousness. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Why would you be hungering and thirsting for that when you can pursue it, when you can have it? But what about justice? And so he flips the terms and
Mm.
says, if they chose to use the word justice instead of righteousness, how would we view the passage differently? Right? Dr. Charlie Dates talks about this, right? Justice and righteousness, the literal words being a choice of what the translators wanted to include. And so if you change that to say, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, how much more does that change and shape how we pursue it, right?
Yeah.
Because we're truly hungry and thirsty for it. But again, every question that we ask, because ideas do matter, every question that we ask should not just be a question of what do I know,
Mm.
but what am I doing with what I know?
Mm.
Not what can I perceive, but how do I apply that which I've understood? And this is application, right? We say this every single weekend in our churches, that you cannot just stay with theology and information, but you have to pass through to practice and application. We say that all the time. We have application points in our sermons, but there's a difference between the two, right?
So the revelation for me, to add on to what you were saying, the revelation for me, not just what we know, not just what we do with what we know, but who are we becoming?
My.
Who are we becoming?
Whew.
That is the thing that I have been uh, mentally masticating on for the past year.
Oh, no, stop. Don't do
I
it.
have
Don't
been
do it. This boy a
cogitating.
PhD for real. This boy a PhD for real. Watch.
And so it's not so when we talk about how far have we come, what progress have we made, has any change occurred, most of the time what are we talking about? We're talking about stuff out there. We're talking about the world externally. We're talking about laws and policies that have changed, practices that have changed. But how often when we stop to assess the movement for Black lives or the Black freedom struggle, how often do we stop to assess how have we changed? Because the struggle changes you. I'm going to read it again because I already wrote it.
My.
So I say this.
Whew.
The value of fighting racism cannot be gauged simply by looking at the number of laws passed or individuals elected. It cannot be measured in funds raised or in how many members an organization has. These data points matter, but they are not all that matter. Fighting racism is not just about how it changes the world, it's also about how it changes you.
Hmm.
And if we think in the Bible about how often, God doesn't look on the outward appearance, right? He says, inside you're like whitewashed tombs or filthy sepulchres.
Hmm.
He says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, right? God is concerned not
Yes.
just about what we do, but about who we are and who we are becoming.
Hmm.
I'll put another sort of historical footnote here. I'm
Mama.
researching a guy named Albert Clegg Jr.,
Yeah.
who was a
Black
radical
Messiah.
black pastor in Detroit. He led the movement for something called Black Christian nationalism, which is all kinds of interesting. But he led a church called the Shrine of the Black Madonna, and had this big mural of Mary, an Afrocentric Mary and baby Jesus painted
Mm-hmm.
in his church. Anyway, it's really interesting. He's reflecting in 1968 after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And he's basically saying, I didn't at all agree with King's words. All these, words about having a dream and interracial cooperation. He's like, I
I love
didn't
Black
like.
Shade. I'm sorry. I love Black Shade. The Lord is delivering me from that.
This is one of my big things is like, we are not monolithic whatsoever. So you had black clergy like Albert Clegg who just didn't like King's message, but he actually pointed out the value in King's method.
Mm.
So he was talking about
Mm.
how Clegg was like, I don't buy this nonviolent stuff, but in the confrontations that King and the demonstrators provoked, they actually did two things. One, they revealed what white people were truly about, because they provoked this brutality, this inhumanity, right? And it exposed some white people for what they really thought and believed. But the second thing he said was, it provoked a sense of courage in Black people.
Mm.
And so he says it this way, but the victory was not in what white people did or didn't do. The victory was in how we were changing and in what was happening in our minds.
Yes.
Not that any real solution was being arrived at, but we were beginning to feel that we were becoming a people and that we could stand up against white people, right? So I think he's getting again at this idea of how resistance doesn't just change the world, it changes us.
Yes.
And so
yes.
all I'm asking is for us to expand the aperture of effectiveness. Widen the frame from just evaluating the progress of a movement based on laws, policies, elected officials. That matters. I'm not saying diminish that. I'm saying add to it. Who are you becoming in the struggle?
Wow. Wow. Look, y'all need to say it with my. My. That's so powerful, because I think sometimes, and this is the helpfulness of the conversation, right? This is the helpfulness for, the wrestle and the tug of war between the symbolic and the substance, right? It's so helpful because there are tangible elements, and yes, there are intangible elements of what this is doing to us,
right,
and how it is shaping us. I had an interview with Terrence Lester, who runs Love Beyond Walls, today. And he said, as a sneak preview of that interview, he said, I said, how has Love Beyond Walls shaped your view of justice? How has Love Beyond Walls shaped your view of creating your own table and your own organization? He said, when I started, I had a misconception that I was building something. But then I started to realize that God was using the organization to build me.
Exactly.
That the work I was doing was formational work, not just for the world, but for me.
My.
Not just for the people I was coming in contact with, but for my heart and my soul. I'm different because of the work I did
That's exactly
and the
right.
work I'm doing.
That's exactly right.
And a lot of us don't have categories because if you want to talk about a dichotomy, a bifurcation, so to speak, between body and soul, we should also talk about between faith and work.
Mm, that's good.
Oh, we are pastors, we are podcasters, we're people. It's all integrated within what we do and who we are, right? And so it was so helpful for me to hear someone doing such great work on the ground say the organization is good, but the organization is shaping and changing my
Yeah,
soul.
yeah, yeah.
The organization is shaping and changing my work. And this is why I heard Ted Davis
I'll
say
tell you, we could just entitle this episode My."
my. Yeah, we go. Oh, Destiny is always here supporting. We see you. We see you. Yeah, I think, and I think it's important that we make sure that in our justice framing and our justice metric, we also measure the metric of how much hope still springs up in our hearts.
Mm-hmm.
How much hope, how much hope still wells up in our souls. How much does the urgency of the body also say George Floyd's daughter deserves a world to live in now that is just and equitable? We failed George Floyd. We failed Breonna Taylor. We failed Ahmaud Arbery. We failed the countless names that have come before, but their families are still here for us to fight for.
Yeah.
And we must create a world with them in mind, and that leads us to say, as much as I want to stop talking about this, I could talk
Mm.
about anything. We talk about anything else. As much as I stop talking about this, I'm tired of talking about race and justice and the body and black bodies and other. The hope is the world can be different for them. The world can be different for my children. The world can be different for your son. The world can be different. And that's where the hope is, where the argument happens, right? Where
So
the pain of my blackness and the hope of my Jesus centeredness start boxing, and then they hopefully start dancing.
yes, yes. Oh man, I have so many thoughts based on what you said. I'll need to trademark this or something, but we talk about Afro pessimism at the top of this show.
Sure, sure.
There are people who talk about Afrofuturism,
Mm.
imagining a new future for Black people. I think there's space in the dialogue for Afro-realism.
Hmm.
Afro-realism, which is
Unpack it.
my Blackness and my Christianity in conversation.
Hmm.
It is my present circumstances and my eternal hope in dialogue. It is that tension we feel between knowing how deep white supremacy goes. That to pull it up by the roots is going to be real difficult, and we probably won't see the changes we hope to see, at least not all of them, even in our own lifetime, right? At the same time, knowing that change is possible, that change has occurred. I'll never forget John Lewis, the late congressman and civil rights activist, addressing this question, basically addressing Afro-pessimism. He's saying, if you think things haven't changed, walk a mile in my shoes. Right? But we know that realism is different from pessimism and different from optimism, right? So pessimism says things can't change. Optimism says things have already changed or will change.
Right.
Realism holds those both in conversation, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is this: as we think about fighting racism and assessing, right? Like when I was a teacher, you always began your lesson or your course with the assessment. You began by determining the criteria for success. Otherwise, how would you know that you were being effective? So I think we need to think deeply about the criteria for success when it comes
Yeah.
to racial justice. And then I
Mm-hmm.
go back to, the framework I use in How to Fight Racism, the arc of racial justice, right?
Yes.
Awareness, relationships, commitment. As we're assessing our progress, are we and others growing in awareness? I can tell you, yeah, for sure, because if you look at the bestseller list from 2020, even a book by me can make the bestseller list, right? Because people were wanting to build their awareness.
Mm-hmm.
But awareness in and of itself is not a substitute for substance, for substantive change, right? Can be merely symbolic to have these
Yeah.
books in your library. We look at relationships. One of the things that I think about in terms of progress in relationships is that in the 2020 uprisings, we saw more white people participating than ever before. We saw people of Asian descent and Latinx descent. It was truly a cross-racial, cross-ethnic movement in a way that we didn't see in the civil rights movement 50 and 60 years ago. And that's on the macro level. We can go down to the micro. It's not true across the board, not by any means, but it can be true for you.
Right.
And then
Right.
lastly is the commitment aspect, which gets to those bigger things about policies and laws and systems, right?
Hmm.
And not everything has changed, but this sort of goes back to the awareness piece where we're seriously talking about how defunding the police might work.
Right.
We're seriously talking, I love the phrase reimagining public safety
Mm-hmm.
because it's so much more comprehensive than
Brilliant. Brilliant.
reimagining public safety, because the ostensible goal of policing is public safety. But when we know that law enforcement doesn't do that, we got to go back to the drawing board and say, how can we actually envision a different frame for public safety? And this is where you get cities and municipalities actually forming response teams made up of social workers and therapists and people trained in de-escalation and not armed, right? Like these were not serious conversations we were having at the national level prior to last year. And again, it's not only due to last year. It's movement upon movement. It's moment upon moment,
Yes.
brick
Yes.
a day, building upon each other. And the
A
last
brick
thing
a day. Hmm.
is this. This is the last paragraph of the book, and it has to do with hope.
Yes.
We cannot give up. We are people of hope. Hope is not blind optimism. It is a realistic assessment of current conditions with the faith that tomorrow can be different.
Hmm.
We are people who believe that a brutal, unjustified murder resulted in a resurrection. We believe that a poor carpenter from Nazareth conquered death and is forming a people who will join in this triumph. Each
Yes.
day that we live is the opportunity to be witnesses to the resurrection life and the coming kingdom of God. We pray and work for that kingdom to come and for God's will to be done, not just in the sweet by and by, but right here and now. The journey for racial justice continues, but the music we hear along the way is not a funeral dirge. It is festival music, leading us to a banquet of blessings and a harvest of righteousness. Today is the day, and now is the time to join this journey toward racial justice.
Look, man, when you wrote that, you was Steph in in 2015, bro. You was Steph in the 2021 in February when he was scoring 40 a game.
Oh my,
You
oh my,
was getting double and triple team shooting it up.
bro, look.
He said the music in the funeral dirge. I remember reading that. I
This
was
is
like, where my pen at? Where my pen at? Let me throw something at Jemar.
this is the work. This is the work. As we look with Afro realism at the situation and the circumstances we confront, shall we remain a people of hope?
And this is why I recently talked about the paradox, right? Because what happens in the paradox? What happens in the paradox of being Black and Christian? What happens in the midst of in between death and the birth of a new system? What happens in between our slaughtered sons and birthing new daughters, right? What happens, right? God meets us in the midst of it. And that's why I don't let go of Jesus.
Mm.
That's why I don't let go of Jesus. I don't let go of Jesus because I know Jesus isn't mess averse, but Jesus is close to it. Jesus is in it with me. Jesus promised me, I don't know about you, but he promised me he would never leave me nor forsake me. That's the Jesus I know. That's why I don't get rid of Jesus. And so Jesus meets me in my Afro-realism. Jesus meets me in my paradox.
Mm. Jesus
I ain't trying to turn
is
it into a
out
sermon.
there.
What'd you say?
Jesus is the realest G out there. He's not scared of the mess.
He's died before and come back. But and you know, we don't even always go here. But I'm just saying that's why I don't let go of Jesus. Forget what they told you. God meets us right in the middle of it. And if God meets me in the middle of it, that's a God worth holding on to.
Mm. Praise the Lord.
And that's a God that can help me make sense of my Afro-realism. Help me make sense of my pain. Help me make sense of this movement. Help me make sense of 1 year later when a man who clearly had no empathy in his heart put a knee on another image bearer of God's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds while the life drained out of him. Can't make sense of that on my own. There may be no sense in it, but if someone can help me process it, that's Jesus.
Only one
Yeah.
thing left to say. My.
Look, so I had tuh, and now I got to switch to my because too many
My.
people taking tuh. Y'all need to pay. Listen, it's trademark. TUH. Tuh. It's trademark. Every time you use it, cash at me 25 cents.
Same with Afro-realism.
Right, exactly. Next time you use Afro-realism in a paper, send Jemar $1. Look, man, yo,
Somebody
this has been
but yeah,
it's been encouraging, bro.
soul
Yes,
feeling. Yeah.
it's encouraging, man. This is encouraging. Anybody got one question? I'll take one question. Is there but one?
Is there one?
Is there but one question? The doors of the church are open.
Every head bowed, every eye closed.
No one looking around. God is watching. We've been in church too long.
Ain't no such of a thing.
Look, man. All right. Well, if there's no other question, we'll just hop out
Praise
before the
God.
question gets
Unified
said.
church.
Exactly right. Well, you know, clap your hands. Nobody raised a hand for salvation, so there's nobody came down. So we'll keep singing the hymn. But yeah, brother, I appreciate you, man. I think this is a moment. I appreciate you pushing us to really talk about this. Every time, you know, these anniversaries and things happen, we have no desire often to talk about it and, you know, share our hearts. But every time we do, the Lord meets us here. And when the Lord meets us here, our souls are filled. You know, the hunger and thirst that we have felt before is satisfied. So I appreciate you, brother.
Appreciate you.
All right, famo. Bless y'all. Love y'all.